But I shall add some particular considerations to inculcate the same more closely. In the third place, besides what is said, to clear the lawfulness and necessity of a public testimony against the evils of the present time, some considerations may be added to prove the expediency of this way and manner of giving a testimony by maintaining held meetings in our present circumstances. Number 1. The keeping of field meetings now is not only most convenient for testifying, but a very significant testimony in itself against this Popish toleration, the wickedness of whose spring and original, and of its nature and terms, channel and conveyance, end and design, is showed in the historical narrative thereof, and cannot be denied by any Presbyterian, whose constant principle is that there should be no toleration of popery, idolatry, or heresy in this reformed and covenanted church. Reason and religion both will conclude that this is to be witnessed against by all that will adhere to the cause of reformation overturned hereby, and resolve to stand in the gap against popery, to be introduced hereby, and that will approve themselves as honest patriots in defending the laws and liberties of the country subverted hereby. And besides, if it be considered the respect to the grantor, it is palpable his design is to introduce popery and advance tyranny, which can be hid from none that accept it, the effectuating whereof hath a necessary and inseparable connection with the acceptance of the liberty, and is so far from being avertible by the acceptors, that it is chiefly promoted by their acceptance, and the design of it is to lay them by from all opposition thereto. If it be considered with relation to the acceptors, it is plain it must be taken as it is given, and received as it is conveyed from its fountain of absolute power, through a channel of an arbitrary law disabling and religion dishonoring toleration, which is always evil, and with consent to the sinful impositions with which it is tendered, concerning and affecting the doctrine of ministers, that they shall preach nothing which may alienate the subjects from the government, against all which there is no access for a protestation, consistent with the improvement of the liberty, for it is granted and accepted on these very terms, that there shall be no protestation, for if there be, that will be found in alienating of their hearts of the subjects from the government, which, by that protestation, will be reflected upon. If it be considered with respect to the addressers for it, who formally say a confederacy with, and congratulate the tolerator for his toleration, and all the mischiefs he is machinating, and effectuously taking upon them to send it in the name of all Presbyterians, it concerns all honest men, zealous Christians, and faithful ministers of that persuasion and denomination, in honor and conscience, to declare to the world by some public testimony that they are not consenters to that sinful, shameful, and scandalous conspiracy, nor of the corporation of these flattering addresses, who have betrayed the cause, with which all will be interpreted consenters that are not contradictors. Further, this toleration is sinful as is cleared above, period 6. And to accept of it is contrary to our solemn covenants and engagements, where we are bound to extirpate popery, preserve the Reformation, defend our liberties, and never to accept of a toleration aversive of all these precious interests we are sworn to maintain. And it is heinously scandalous, being, in effect, a succumbing at length, and yielding up the cause, which hath been so long controverted, and so long contended for, at least an appearance of ceding and lying by from contending for the interests of Christ, of condemning our former wrestlings for the same, of purchasing a liberty to ourselves at the rate of burying the testimony in bondage and oblivion, of hardening and confirming open adversaries in their wicked invasions on our religion, laws, and liberties, of being weary on the cross of Christ, that we would fain have ease upon any terms, and of weakening the hands, yea, condemning the practice and peremptoriness of these that are exempted from the benefit, or rather the snare of it, and suffer when others are at ease. It is also attended with many inconveniences, for either such as preach under the covert of it must forbear declaring some part of the counsel of God, and give no testimony seasonable this day, or else they do, they will soon be discovered and made a prey. Hence, seeing there must be a testimony against this toleration, it is certainly most expedient to give it there, where the meeting is without the reach and bounds of it, and interdicted by the same proclamation that tenders it, and where the very gathering in such places is a testimony against it. For to preach in houses constantly and leave the fields would now be interpreted and homologating the toleration that commands preaching to be restricted, especially when an address is made in name of all that accept the benefit of it, from which odium we could not vindicate ourselves if we should so make use of it. Number 2. The keeping of field meetings now is a testimony against that wicked law that discharges them, and interdicts them as criminal. Yea, in some respect, a case of confession, For if Daniel's case, when public prayer was discharged under pain of death, was a case of confession, as all grant, then must also our case be, when public preaching is discharged under the same penalty. For it is equivalent to an universal discharge of all public preaching, when the manner of it is discharged, which we can only have with freedom and safety in way of public testimony, which can be none other in our circumstances, but in the fields. Again, if the law be wicked that discharges them, as certainly it is, and is demonstrated from what is said already, then it must be sin to obey it, but it were an obeying of it to quit the fields. Number 3. The keeping of field meetings now is a testimony against tyranny and usurpation, encroaching upon our religion, laws, and liberties, and presuming to restrict and bound the exercise of the ministerial function and discharge it altogether, except it be modified according to the circumstances prescribed by a wicked law, which cannot be allowed as competent to any man whose authority is not acknowledged, for reasons given in Head 2. Therefore, though there were no more, this is sufficient to call all ministers to give testimony against such an usurpation, by refusing to obey any such act in preaching where God giveth a call. For otherwise, to submit to it would be an acknowledging of his magistrical power to discharge these meetings, and to give forth sentences against faithful ministers. 4th, the keeping of field meetings now is a testimony for the honor, headship, and princely prerogative of Jesus Christ, which hath been the great word of his patience in Scotland, and by an unparalleled insolence encroached upon by usurpers in our day, and in effect denied by such as took a new holding for the exercise of their ministry, from their usurped power. Now, in these meetings, there is a practical declaration of their holding their ministry and the exercise thereof from Christ alone, without any dependence upon, subordination to, or license and warrant from his usurping enemies, and that they may and will preach in public without authority from them. If then it be lawful and expedient to maintain the interests of a king of clay against an usurper, then much more it must be lawful and expedient to maintain the quarrel of the King of kings, when wicked men would banish him and his interests out of the kingdom by their tyrannical cruelty and cruel mercy of a destructive toleration. 5th, the keeping of field meetings now is a testimony for the gospel and ministry thereof, which is always the dearest and nearest privilege of Christians, and in the present circumstances, when our lives and our all are embarked in the same bottom with it, and fought to be destroyed together with it, by a party conspiring against Christ, it is necessary duty to defend both by resisting their unjust violence, especially when religion and the gospel is one and the chief of our fundamental land rights, and the cardinal condition of the established policy, upon which we can only own men for magistrates by the law of the land. And this testimony, by defense of the gospel and of our own lives, cannot be given expediently anywhere but in the fields. It is also a testimony for the freedom and authority of the gospel ministry, and for their holding their unremovable relation to the Church of Scotland, which is infringed by these tyrannical acts and maintained by these exercises, which is a privilege to be contended for, above and beyond all other that can be contended for or defended, especially to be maintained against those that have no power or authority to take it away. There will no man quit any of his goods upon a sentence coming from an incompetent judge, and shall ministers or people be hectored or fooled from such a privilege by them that have no such power? 6th, the keeping of field meetings now is a testimony for our covenants, the owning whereof is declared criminal by that same law that discharges these meetings, in which we are sworn to preserve the Reformation in doctrine, worship, discipline, and government, and to defend all the Church's liberties, and to oppose all their opposites, and endeavor their extirpation. And in the solemn acknowledgment of sins and engagement to duties we are sworn, because we have of late labored to supplant the liberties of the Kirk, to maintain and defend the Kirk of Scotland, in all her liberties and privileges against all who shall oppose and undermine the same, or encroach thereupon, under any pretext whatsoever. Since then the owning of these meetings and the covenants are both discharged together, and the owning of the covenant does oblige to a public opposition against the dischargers, and an avowed maintenance of the Church's privileges, whereof this is, in a manner, the only and chief liberty now left to be maintained, to keep meetings where we may testify against them, without dependence on their toleration. It must follow that these meetings are to be maintained, which only can be in the fields with convenience. 7th, to give over these field meetings now would be in hardening and encouraging of these enemies in their wicked design of banishing all these meetings out of the land, which manifestly would be defeat by a resolute refusal of all to submit to their discharging of them. And they that do submit and give them over do evidently contribute to the effectuating that wicked design, which is of that sort, but further is intended to extirpate all meetings for gospel ordinances in which there is any testimony against them. To comply, therefore, with such a forbearance of them at this time would lay a stone of stumbling before them, to encourage them in these their designs, when they should see their contrivance so universally complied with, wherein they might boast that at length they had prevailed to quite put away that eyesore of theirs, field meetings. Eighth, to give over these field meetings now were a stumbling to the poor ignorant people, who might think that now it appears that work was but of men, and so hath come to naught, and would look upon it as an evidence of fainting, and succumbing at last in the matter of the testimony, as being quite overcome, and that indeed all have embraced and accepted this present toleration, and all were alike sleeping under the shade and eating the fruits of such a bramble. Ninth, finally, to give over these field meetings now would be a very scandalous thing to the posterity and to strangers who shall read the history of our church, to find that as prelacy came in without a joint witness, and the monstrous blasphemous and sacrilegious supremacy was erected without a testimony in its season, so black popery itself and tyranny was introduced by a toleration which laid them all by from a testimony against these, who formerly had valiantly, resolutely, and faithfully contended against all lesser corruptions. But at last, when that came, and stricter prohibitions of all public meetings, but under the covert thereof, were emitted, then all were persuaded to comply with that course. How astonishing would it be to read that all these contendings, sealed with so much precious blood, should come to such a pitiful period. But I hasten to the next, which is the second positive ground of suffering.